Okay, perfect. It looks like it's working. Hi there, everybody. My name is Renee Hobbs, and welcome to today's webinar. The topic, Translation Matters, How Create to Learn became Create to Learn in Korean. Uh, so, so Jiwon Woon, my very first PhD student and an extraordinary researcher and creative talent in her own right. She's been teaching media literacy for a long time now, maybe 20 years or more. She has a special interest in intercultural communication and a special area of expertise in thinking about how immigrants and people newly arrived to a country need and benefit from media literacy as well. So take it away, Jiwan.
Okay, thank you so much, Renee, for allowing me to present like my process of translating your book and what I have learned from this process. And this is 11 a.m. here in Seattle, and I know it's a different time in different parts of the world and during your busy time. Thank you so much for joining me. So what I will be sharing with you today is, of course, like it's been introduced, it's about like translating two books. So I translated Renee's Create to Learn into Korean, and during this process I really learned a lot about myself, about media literacy, and about what's going on in South Korea in the field of media literacy. So I will share those things. And if you have any questions, like feel free to type your questions in the comment section. There will be plenty of time at the end to do the Q&A. So please, like any questions are welcome. So, okay. So I kind of organized my presentation into three different sections: before translation, during my translation, and after translation. And after translation is probably where I will talk about uh, amazing, the reason for the great reception of the book. The book is doing really well in terms of the sales. I have been contacted by different educators and scholars praising the book, how the book is helping them, and how they are already doing the book club with this book. So there are some reasons why there's amazing hypes of digital literacy in South Korea after the pandemic. So we will talk about like after, like when I talk about after translation. So before translation, like it's about how I decide to translate this book. I was always wondering why none of Renee's book was translated in Korea, because I know there are some books translated in Japan, China, but I didn't think about translating the book myself, because I kind of didn't think of translation as my own thing. But I was just wondering, Rina has been introduced a lot by different scholars, different writing, and that's how I actually knew Rina back year 2002, when I was looking for graduate school. And when people wrote about media literacy in different countries, and when they write about media literacy in the United States, Rene was always introduced as the leading authority in the United States. So I knew Rene back then, and I know Rene is popular among South Korean scholars and educators. But none of her book has been translated. And one day I got an email from the publisher asking me to translate this book. And I told the editor, saying that I never translated the book before, and I know this book is amazing, and I don't want to be the one who do some harm to this way. So I suggested if you can pair me with the professional translator, and if I'm the reviewer of the translation, I think that would be the fine. But the publisher, which is the biggest publisher in the field of media and communication, they told me that that's not how they work, and their rule is always have the expert in the field publish the book so that they know what's actually going on in the book. So I contacted several of my friends in Korea who actually have translated those books. And there are some of my friends, like professors or like other scholars, who have translated their advisors book. Like, I have two friends who were advisors of David Buckingham, and they translated one of, like, David Buckingham's book each. And I asked them what was their experience of translating the book and what they think about me translating Create to Learn. And they wholeheartedly explained me why the advisee of the big scholar should be the one who actually translate the book. And they said that the reason that I should translate Rene's book is that it's because I will be the one who understand the nuance and tones and all those, like, between the lines of what's going on in the book. And they told me that the best person to represent the author would be someone who actually knows that person really well. And they really persuaded me really hard and gave me some like confidence that, like, your Korean is pretty good and you should be able to translate the book. So I, after lots of consideration, and I wrote an email to Rene that I got contacted by the publisher, and what do you think about it? And Rene said, oh, that would be really great. And so I decided to translate this book after that. And in the beginning, I thought, oh, well, my Korean, both Korean and English, is good enough for me to take classes, write scholarly paper, like do any form of communication. So I thought that, oh, translation would not be that hard. But as I start to translate the book, I learned that there are several things that I had to do. So first thing that I had to do as I start the translation is putting myself in reader's shoes. So would Korean understand these terms, concepts, and cultural references? For me, when I first came to the United States, I was able to do my homework. I was able to understand what's going on in the classroom. But I remember not being able to follow the, like, daily talk when I went to a party or having like lunch or coffee with my friends. So on being able to understand the scholarly terms is not necessarily the same as being able to freely communicate during your daily life. And because Rene used a lot of examples, and there are so many, like, cultural cues and terms, I also first need to decide whether this would be understood by other Koreans. Another thing that I need to decide is, what should their reading experience be? Should they just continuously read, like have flow, and continuous flow of reading experience without interruption, or will they have to do the internet search as they read? So it was another big decision I had to make, because I remember whenever I read many translated academic books, I was literally Googling many of the terms, concepts, because I didn't understand what they are referring to. So I also had to decide what would be their reading experience be. So my training in media literacy was actually really helpful in this process, because one thing that we always think about as a media literacy scholar is thinking about how different audience will interpret this message differently, right? So this was my own media literacy experience, how different readers would understand these concepts and book differently. So I had to first decide the target audience. Would my target audience be teachers, college professors, teachers and college professors, anyone interested in media literacy? And one thing that I had to think about is the market in South Korea. I mean, South Korea is the size of Kentucky. It's like so small size. And even the population, it's not compared to United States, it's small. So if I just limit my target audience to teachers or only college professors, it would be only small handful of people. So I decided this book would be the right fit for any educators who want to do the professional development. So I put my target audience as even someone who will be introduced to digital media literacy with this book. So even those novice scholars or teachers, educators would understand media literacy. So what I decide to do is have my book as a continuous flow. So like they will not have to do the Google search. They will not have to have their phone next to them to search for certain terms and cultural context. So because I decide to make this as their reading experience, so I mean, I know you will not be able to understand like this. So this is just some of those examples of like my numerous footnotes. So I included, so for instance, this one is just updates to the recent data. So whenever the statistics or numbers are provided, I checked if there are like more recent data. So for instance, this one, the number was from 2015, but I updated the numbers. And this one is the brief footnotes about Eric Carr, because in the United States, everybody will know Eric Carr, but not in South Korea. And the Bill of Rights. This is another footnotes about the Bill of Rights, which is really new for many Koreans. So I put anything that the authors will not understand. I put the footnotes. And here are another example of footnotes. So this one is the footnotes for the Super Bowl. And why, like halftime ad, like, Super Bowl matters. So I explained about about the Super Bowl and those meme that Renee introduced. I didn't think that people will understand. For instance, this is the best kind of green. All those marijuana and all those things are illegal in South Korea, and though they will not understand like what does this even mean. So these are my translation of each meme, and I had like specific footnotes about like even refer like introducing the article, Times article about why there are so many different names for weed, and I introduced that article and why green, what green means here. So translating this book took me so much of my time because like there are footnotes after footnotes so that readers will be understanding what this means. And I have to say that I kind of learned this attitude from Renee a lot. When I was in my graduate school, most of my classes were seminar style. So we just read our reading and go there and then discuss. But for me, taking Renee's media and children class was literally cultural shock because every class was different, and she literally make sure that everybody understood like what is going on in the classroom. So for me, that was really eye-opening. And as a teacher and professor, there was like the time when I started to think more about how students would understand what I'm talking about in the classroom. So as I was translating this book, that kind of reminded me of my teaching. So, when I teach in the college classroom, I had lots of professors who didn't understand why students didn't understand. So I wanted to become the teacher who do not just assume that my students will understand everything, but try to understand what they know and what they don't know, and try to provide all those footnotes. One other thing that I had to decide was the tone of the language. Those who don't know Korean will probably have a hard time what I'm talking about. So in Korea, there are numerous ways to say hello. Like when you are saying to older people, younger people, among friends. So should I make my book written using honorific and polite language or informal language. And it's kind of hard to explain because when you say informal language, it's casual, right? But then this is the tone that most academic books use. So I compared the different books in the field, and most books were written in informal language, but I decided to use honorific and polite language because that's the way for them to easily understand. So after book was published, I got the comments about, like some comments like about this tone, that how this was helpful for them to better understand each sentence. So this was another example where I tried to put myself in readers' shoes, and which one would be easier for them to understand.
So I wanna see if I understand what you just said, Jiwon, because it seems so counterintuitive. So the more the style that is less informal is actually more comprehensible.
So I use the term informal because there's no better way to say it. So I would say this is more of determined tone. So you just explain it without having another better polite gesture in your communication.
Right.
So this is the tone that people would say older people talk to the younger people, or a teacher talk down to students, something like this. But
I get it.
here is like the perfect. So another difficult thing about translation was sometimes there is no exact word to translate because though there are two different languages, and sometimes there are certain words that are easily translated, but then there are certain things that you have to understand the cultural nuance and tones and everything. So even though I use informal language to explain what was going on, I would say this was more of like dry tone, kind of dry, to the point, explanatory language. But I try to become more of respectful, polite way of explaining things. So that kind of made each sentence longer. So, so there are more words to be included. And I did the sample translation of the first chapter, asking the editor what she thought about it. And she said that this is not a usual way of doing it, but then she really liked how it's so easy to understand. So that's why I use very and polite language. And another, like after book was released, the one professor contacted me. Oh, I don't understand why you used this tone, but then I want to say that you made the right choice to use this tone because he said that this is so easy for him to understand. There was
What a fascinating. Thank you so much for explaining your strategy, because and I like how that strategy is rooted in this deep pedagogical principle of respect for the reader. So that was a very, very helpful to understand a concept that's hard for English speakers to understand. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Okay, so I will move on to what I have prepared next. So for me, the benefits of translation can be explained by powers of two that Summer Institute really highlights, and also the concept that was introduced in the book. So before having this translation experience, I mean, going back to my translation experience, I have actually had some translation experience, but it was more of a couple pages of translation. It was like my part-time work during my while I was in college. So it wasn't like translating a book. But for me, most of my bilingual experience was not actually having two languages together. What I mean by that is I speak Korean with Korean, like, people. I speak English with those who can speak English or those who cannot speak Korean. So for me, it was like having myself, one side of me, who can speak Korean, another side of me who can speak English. But I feel like those two, um, like ego didn't actually interact together, because for me it's not like translate myself. I mean, when you first learn the language, I mean, for me, I have very limited Thai, Spanish, and Chinese. So when I speak those like other languages, I translate those two languages. So I first think about what I want to say and then speak in Thai or speak in Chinese. But for me, my English and Korean, it's kind of, I don't have to translate. I just comes directly, right, like from myself. So uh, if you don't speak more than one language, it's hard to explain, but I sometimes feel like there are two different, like, self, two different G1, and those two G1s are not exactly the same G1. Because for me, my husband even told me that my voice is different when I speak Korean and when I speak English. And I think because of the language difference, I feel like the way I think, create, imagine is different. And when I translate one language into others, that provided like very deep interaction with the text, because you have to think about the text into one language and then translate into another text. So that was really mega cognitive like reading experience. And because there were two, of myself, there were like kind of the magic of two, where there were more room for creativity and inspiration. So I hear some of my friends telling me that, oh, you don't really need to learn your new language because there are Google Translate, and people can translate, like those AI will be able to translate the language all the time. And that may be true in the future, but I think that kind of ignores the benefits of having like multiple languages. It's not only about being able to express, like being able to communicate with others, but it's more of, there's a lot of benefits. I mean, you probably have heard a lot of cognitive and social advantages of bilingual mind, and even how, those who speak multiple languages or have less chance of getting Alzheimer. And for me, that kind of allowed this translation experience allowed me to see how there are so much rooms for creativity and like inspiration. So for me, this process allowed me to find my new dream, new path, and what I want to do, like, like next phase of my life. So this was a really life changing experience for me. So, and like about those who say that, oh, because we have Google Translate, I don't need to learn another language. I mean, if you see the quality of translation these days, I mean, you will not want to use Google Translate to represent what you say. There are certain languages where they do good job, but at least as far as from my own experience, like translation between Korean and English back and forth, like at least Google wasn't doing good job. So rather than just relying on your those phone or AI translator, there are lots of benefits of like speaking, learning, understanding multiple languages. Um, so I finished the translation, and there are several things that we added to the new book. So Rene was so kind enough to write a new preface for Korean readers, which allowed Korean readers to be engaged to the book. And I also added like my own preface, like kind of writing about the history, my own history with Rene, how I first wrote an email to Rene and how I got contacted with Rene, and how Rene's all of classes has been so kind to students. And I kind also said that just like Renee's book and her classes, I did my best to be kind to the readers. And we also added an interview with Renee. We had like several questions about what is going on after the pandemic, and Rina answered some with some helpful tips to Korean educators, those who want to adopt the Create to Learn in their classes. One of the biggest struggle and some conflicts for me with the publisher was the title. So title, before I published this book, I didn't know that usually the title is the one that many authors and translators have the issue with the publisher. So my original attempt was to direct translate of the title, Create to Learn, Introduction to Digital Literacy. But then the Korean title, as you can see from this very long title, this is like Digital Media Literacy Lesson, and then blog, podcast, photography, and like listing all those like 9 media platforms that we introduced, and then Create to Learn at the end. So it took us so long to compromise the title, and I honestly wasn't very excited with this title. And one thing I even told the editor is, I feel like this is the hashtag in the Instagram where you list so many things, and those people who search for certain terms will be able to get it, and this is not the sexy title that I was looking for. And the editor keeps saying that we don't need the sexy title, and if anybody searches for the certain terms and then they end up like this book, then we are very fine with it. So, I mean, there were several other titles before that. And one of the things that I ditched, I said no, never ever, was like they even had the title like do digital media literacy. And so title was doing media literacy and some abstract terms. So this was kind of their rationale. So this title was from the publisher, and their rationale was to readers understand, potential readers understand, what they can expect from the book. And since the book is doing pretty well, I want to say that probably they understood the market better than I did, because I'm totally new in this field. So after the book was released, I mean, this is just like some random capture of what's going on. So this is not the total ranking, but the ranking among education books. So these are like rankings from top online bookstores. So there are several versions of Amazon in South Korea. So like some of them it was like 14, some of them is 21, some of them it was like the 5 in the category of education. When I checked yesterday, because it's updated yesterday every day, it was like 32 in education. So the book is still doing very well. And there are some people even like wrote a review and then like 5 stars. And one thing I want to talk about, about this reception, is why South Korean teachers are reading this book. So as you all know, we are still going through the pandemic, and it's not over yet. And in South Korea, the education system is totally different. So we have government curated, sponsored content. So government decide which textbook to use. I mean, it's not like one book for the subject, but there are certain subjects the government make the textbook, and there are some other subjects where the government provides some options to choose from, like 5 or 6 or 7, and then school can decide which textbook they use. So the system is totally different in South Korea. And so we have a lot of contents and curates by the government, not only the textbook, and also they have called the broadcasting stations called EBS, Educational Broadcasting Station, and they offer a lot of tips. And another background to understand that is, some of you probably know that South Korea has very high academic oriented culture. And there has been some gap between those who are from rich upper class kids versus like lower middle class kids who cannot afford to the private tutoring or going to the academic institute after the public school. So this public television is actually offering tutoring like by the government. So they provide like all those educational contents and websites where kids who don't have enough money, who cannot afford to have a private tutor, actually use public TV and then websites to teach themselves. So they hire the top teachers to provide those lessons and classes. Another thing to understand what happened before pandemic, I mean, although the things kind of influenced what happened after the pandemic, is South Korea has a collectivistic culture, and it's different from individualistic culture where they work together and they often share their tips and resources. So there had been a lot of websites where teachers were sharing their teaching resources, assignments, and there are also teacher influencers. Those teacher influencers, if they are teachers in public school, they cannot even make money from YouTube because they are hired by the government, and those people who are hired by the government are not allowed to make extra money. So they are not doing this to make money, but then they are like sharing their resources. So we had a teacher influencer who had been popular in YouTube or other online communities where teachers were sharing their resources. And talking about teacher community, one of the prominent groups that contributed to the development of media literacy education in South Korea was a teacher association. So teachers gathered together to study media literacy, to implement media literacy. So they voluntarily formed the community to develop their expertise. So all those things were going on before the pandemic, and the pandemic started. And then, as we all know, the teachers kind of faced this disrupted classroom environment. So when the pandemic started, there had been huge debates between real-time learning and blended learning. And because we had all these things already, because we had all those amazing contents by the government, guaranteed by the government already, when pandemic started, we had all those resources available. And what many teachers actually did was assigning those outside resources, those like YouTube link or other outside external links or lecture from other teacher influencer rather than them teaching. So they assigned those like videos or links, and then give them homework, and then teacher's role was checking those homework. And parents got so pissed off by that, how come my kids never get to see their teacher? Why don't you more actively communicate with my kids? So there were even government petition about making it mandatory, real-time learning mandatory. So there had been huge debates about with how much teachers should meet students online, what's the blended learning's influence. And another huge debate was the debates on manual. So because we had all those government curated contents and all those teacher influencers before the pandemic, and because those resources were heavily used during the pandemic, there were same lessons everywhere. So some teachers, teachers in the big city, rural area, like big class, small class, they were all having the same class. And some may argue that this is good because everybody gets to learn same things and there is no differences. But increasing number of teachers start to think about this issue, like what teachers have taught is not really what students learned. And even though they were getting all those contents from those teacher influencers or online TV and channel, are they really learning? Okay, they have watched this and they did their homework. So teachers start to think about what actually they have watched or learned does not necessarily means that what they have actually observed. So I think the pandemic allowed educators to think about more about teaching, learning, and all those things. And about the real-time learning itself, even though many parents argued in the beginning that, okay, do the more real-time learning. I mean, now people are having Zoom fatigue. It's so tired of sitting in front of the camera, the computer all the time. So it's the real-time really the solution. And there are another issue of digital devices and physical space. South Korea government and those big tech companies in South Korea promptly worked with the government to distribute digital devices so that everybody can be connected. And they even made educational video system contents free when they were using the Wi-Fi, or even they are using cellular data. If you are using like the certain contents like to learn or to be connected to the classroom, those contents were free. So they said that, oh, we solved the issue of digital gap because we have provided those devices and we made those Wi-Fi or cellular connection for free if you are using those things for education purposes. But you cannot provide them house. So what happens if you live in a small one-bedroom apartment, 3 kids are connected to the classroom, and then if all 3 teachers are doing online live class, and if they are required to turn on the video, how can those 3 kids in the same room actually do their lessons, like in the classes, if they are forced to speak out in front of their device? So the issue of digital devices and physical space emerged more and more. And so people start to question about the effective use of real-time learning and blended learning. So I think things have gotten a lot better because now first and second graders and high school seniors are fully went back to school, and other graders, they go to school every other day if the whole school students are less than 300 students. And if the school with less than 300 students, they go to school every day. If it's more than 300 students, they go every other day. So the situation has been a lot better. And then it looks like teachers are getting used to the blended learning. And now people are talking about what we need to do to prepare for the post-pandemic. So the good thing is happening is state government released the ordinance on the support and of the remote learning. And they also, like, there are some other Office of Education where they announced the ordinance on the support of media literacy education. And they also now, the government and the big tech company is preparing for the post-pandemic, because now they can use Zoom and Google Meet for free, but they know someday it will be very expensive. So they are now getting ready to have our local from Korea platform. So for instance, in South Korea, if you work for the government, you have to use the remote meeting. This is like all those things, remote meeting, GroupMe, Naver Whale, these are all local video conferencing software from Korea. So they are also getting ready to be ready if something like this happens again. And they also learned some benefits of remote learning as well. So if you want to balance this, they kind of start to feel that we really need to have our own platform rather than relying on big tech companies from other countries, which is United States. So they are getting ready for this. And there's another like the changes I started to make. So this is the picture of the one classroom in the first grade elementary school. So this is a newly renovated classroom. So if you look at this picture, now in this school, this is a public school in Busan where they recently announced the media literacy legislation. And first and second graders, they all get their own tablet PC. And from grade 3 to 6, they all get their own laptop from school. And they also learn that device is not the way to solution. The physical space of the classroom also needs to be different. So this is where they charge their devices, like the classroom wasn't looking like this before, but then they added like, places for them to hang out and have fun. So going back to why this book is having the good reception, why the Create to Learn is read by many Korean scholars, I think is because many educators are thinking about those issues. Like they are thinking about, because what they have taught is not necessarily what students learned, they are thinking about how to make them actually learn. And I think like the Create to Learn provides some good answers and ways to creatively alternate their lesson plans. So I think the book was released in a really good time where many teachers are studying a lot and they want to improve themselves a lot. And if you look at South Korean teachers, school of education is so hard to get in South Korea. And usually top students are the ones who are admitted to the school of education. And they are the ones who want to develop themselves and do the professional development and, like improve their classes. So yeah, this is what I have prepared for this Create to Learn webinar. And if there's any question or anything you want to chat about, I will be more than happy to answer and talk with you.
Wow, that was awesome. So let's give Jiwon a round of applause. Jiwon, that was fascinating. We have 45 minutes for discussion. And in the room, we have folks from officially bilingual countries like Canada, countries like Georgia, Bulgaria, Turkey. Juan, I don't know what country you are from. Regina, I think you're from Brazil, but I'm not sure. So let's see how our international community responds. What ideas resonated with you in this book? What ideas that Jiwan talked about could you relate to?
Well, I would like to begin with congratulating this amazing job, really, the very great project. And I also wanted to ask about, turn back to the tone issue, language tone. I have the same issue I'm not doing professional translating maybe, but when you use certain tone or certain phrases, it can kind of signal to a like the level of sincerity or the level of respect that other stuff. Even when you pick a tone in your work, you might be considered like belong to a certain discourse in the society. So when you are picking your tone in your work, have you ever considered that, okay, like that kind of bothers me because you are positioning yourself in the society as well as the American culture as well. So combining these two, like reconcile these two with each other is should be very hard, I imagine. So can you elaborate more a little bit on that?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think the reason most of the academic books in South Korea use the certain tones is to convey their expertise and their knowledge. So um, that tone mostly used in academic books in South Korea kind of is the tone where you talk down to the reader. I mean, it's not, it's hard to explain. It's not really talk down, but then you put yourself as an expert's position and then you explain. And then you assume readers are the ones, as like a students, you understand from your readers. And there is like huge, when people compare America or Western education system and um, Korean education system. I don't want to say Asian because every Asian country is different. Is one people often say as a joke is in America or in certain Western countries, if students don't understand, it's a teacher's fault. But in Korea, if students don't understand, it's a student's fault. So if students are the ones in Korea should be so that's like the mindset of college professors.
Right.
Most college professors in South Korea, that they just like pour out all the knowledges they know and not thinking about whether students understand or not, because it's their job to understand and study in advance to understand teachers' lectures. So I think that kind of culture kind of transferred to many academic books where they use like the certain tones where they position themselves as an experts. And when I was first translating the first few sentences, I used that tone because I reviewed other translated books in the field of media literacy and digital literacy. And all the books, except when the book was targeting parents, most of the books targeting like scholars, educators were using the certain tones where you kind of make yourself dry and you just expect your readers to understand. But when I kind of changed the tone and then read it myself, I felt like this was more close and to the heart of myself. And to me, I mean, one of the things that my friends, when she said, "Oh, you should translate Dr. Hobbs' book," she was a student of David Buckingham, and she has met Renee in person as well. Her name is Hyun-Sun Jung, and she said that you will be the person who can communicate Renee's exciting voice and excitement the best. And to me, I mean, I know Renee's way of talking and her voice. And when I use the certain tone, that's not really her way of talking, even though it's in Korean. So for me, it's deciding how to best communicate Renee's voice to my Korean audience. And maybe I have lived in the United States too long that I didn't want to become the experts where I just expect my students or readers to understand everything. I want to be responsible for them to understand things. And if they don't understand certain things, I also want to take a responsibility as well. So that's like how I decide the tone. And I think the tone back then I didn't know, but then I think because the tone was because of the by using certain tone and language, I think that's why even my friends who knew nothing about media literacy, they bought this book, because they are my friends, and they read it, and they said, "Oh, this is like great book that I really enjoyed it." And I didn't expect them to understand, and I think they told me the truth because I kind of tried to make it as easy as possible.
Right.
So there are many layers of decision to make.
Renee, I hadn't even ever thought about this, but since you have such an international audience, are you thinking about, because you're a storyteller, right? You're informal, you're a storyteller. So are you thinking about how
No.
different cultures? so we spend all this time talking about rhetorical context and
Never thought
are you
about
thinking about a
international
US audience? That was a great question.
And I'm feeling the part that just killed me, Jiwan, is you're showing about my memes about drug use. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that's horrifying. I should never have put that in this book. Oh, totally terrible. I'm talking about marijuana memes in a book for students? What is wrong with me?
No, I think that was a great example to show the huge cultural difference between American and South Korea. And without the footnotes, Korean will never understand what green means unless they have lived or some close connection like here. So yeah, that was a great example to showcase that one.
Joanne, this is fantastic, and it's also given me so much idea for the students that I work with who are not native English, but and how do I meet their needs sometimes when they don't get some of the Englishisms, right? So one of my questions is, at any point, did you and Renee consider actually changing any of the rhetorical examples to suit their culture, to suit Korean culture?
I didn't omit anything. There wasn't anything that I didn't include because of that. But there are certain things to, how can I say, tone down, like so when there are like certain example about like the violence or like sex, like when there are certain examples like from like those context, there are different languages that I could choose from. But so that's why I kind of used like try to tone down, and I not omitting anything was kind of my rule from the beginning, because when I first came to the United States to do my master's degree, sometimes I couldn't understand some of the books that I was asked to read. For instance, like Habermas, like, it was so hard for me to understand in English. And I got that book in Korean and I also couldn't understand either. And the more confused, not the book from Habermas, but there are certain books, other books where I compared like line by line. There are some books like there was omitted, like one sentence or two. And I kind of thought that they was doing the disadvantage to my readers. So, but then there are many, many cases where I break one sentence into 3 sentences, 4 sentences, and 5 sentences. But yeah, like, I had to make my own choices about what words that I should use. But
I think it's so fascinating. I think it's so fascinating that you used your experience as a reader to to decide what stance to take as the translator, right? That you didn't like when stuff is omitted, right? You wanted the one continuous flow of reading. In fact, even when you described that method, you said I had to choose, do I want the reader to have one continuous flow of reading, or should they be reading with the Google looking thing? And I think, who would want to read that way, right? But I could see how if you're reading Habermas, you might need to read that way, right? So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to me. And I want to comment on this other thing, this big, profound idea, the way you very skillfully bring the matters of translation into issues of pedagogy. It is kind of radical to claim responsibility for what learners learn. It is. It's radical to do that. And it changes the way we teach, right? And I feel like part of the challenge for folks in higher education is that the hierarchies of power allow us to not be responsible for what our students learn, right? And many of us in higher education have colleagues for whom they are proud to fail students. They are proud not to change a thing about the way they teach during the pandemic, right? And I feel like maybe that's the radical nature of the strategic decisions you made as a translator, reflecting the ethos that no, I will be I'm going to try to be responsible for what learners take away from the book. So I think that's a really I hope other people may copy you.
Absolutely. And our high school teachers, because I work with high school teachers, even they prep their students for us by telling them that the onus will be on them and that we're not responsible. We're just content experts who don't know how to teach. Sometimes they'll actually tell them that and kind of put the fear of God into them that they're going to have to figure it out.
I do wonder if the audience for this Create to Learn, though, has already made that shift from didactic to constructivist kind of thinking, because you're talking about Create to Learn. Now, I'm going to make some assumptions here, and I could be totally off, but my guess is it's been historically with Korean and education more of a that sort of consumptive kind of approach. Here's this information. You were talking about the subject experts earlier. I'm going to fill you up with this information. It's your responsibility to take that information in. But Create to Learn, creation by its very nature, I think, is much more open. So I wonder, less behavior. So I wonder if your audience already has already been sort of the early adopters.
Yeah, what a great question.
Kind of way of instruction.
Right. So Jiwon, are Korean teachers up to the challenge of empowering students to create to learn? Or what obstacles are still present for them?
So going back to the systematic problem is in South Korea, if everybody does amazing job, you cannot just give them everybody A. So there are certain number of students who should be getting A, certain number of students should be getting B, and some people should be getting D and F. So because of those like hierarchy in the grade system, I think some teachers are glad that some students are failing. Oh, I don't have to worry about whom to fail. Oh, you earned your D, you earned your C and F. So I think they kind of used to make teachers passive and not really working hard, because some students will work hard anyway, no matter what. I mean, I think there are some students who will still get A if monkey is in the classroom and they teach the class. And because they will do their work like by themselves, like reading, studying, asking questions. And there are some students, like no matter how teachers try, like, they will be just not active, not motivated. So I think that system, especially in higher education, kind of pushed educators to be passive about encouraging students actively learning. So I think there's one systematic issue, and I think the one positive change made after pandemic is the curve of the grade used to be like this in South Korea. So there are some students who are doing really well, some students who are not doing well, and lots of in the middle. But the grade report, especially post primary to secondary education, is like this these days. There are more students who are doing well, because those students who get a lot of support from their parents, those who could hire private tutor, after pandemic, they said that they liked the remote learning because they were able to focus themselves better at home. So these students did really well. And those who used to be in the middle, who came to school, who learned at school, those students lost that opportunity. And then the curve became like this. And it really kind of was the red flag for teachers to see, oh, we thought that we did our lesson. I assigned the homework. I give them grade, but then the test scores kind of was like this. So they pushed teachers to study what is going on. And I think some challenging factors in South Korea is very competitive academic environment. And if you do something new in public school, there are some other teachers. I mean, this is what I've heard from educators in South Korea, that sometimes you are less encouraged to try something new, like the create to learn pedagogy, because like other teachers, oh, if you do that, I have to do that too. Like, that's more work. Why are you putting yourself into trouble? Let's just do whatever we have done for like thousands of years. Like, don't try something new. So there are some culture. I mean, some positive aspects of collectivistic culture would be people work together to make differences. But another like aspects is, if you become different, like other people will be like, why? But then going back to like the pandemic, I think pandemic gave opportunity for teachers to try new, because we all know that this is problematic. And as I said before, there had been number of teachers who had been working together to do media literacy, to study media literacy, to implement media literacy. And those teachers association even published their own textbook, their own teaching resources. And I see more and more teachers joining this group, and this is becoming so big.
Yeah, that is so exciting. And in some ways, then, like you said, the timing of the pandemic also then created this a reward system now for this group of folks who do see a way of making a difference. Jiwon, this was absolutely fascinating. And I do want to encourage you to think about how you might want to share for the Media Education Lab community your encounters with translation in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, in Asia. We would absolutely welcome continuing this conversation as we think about how culture, identity, and the pedagogies of media literacy kind of fit together. So Jiwon, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to share my screen for my YouTube viewers who might want to know what's happening this week at the Media Education Lab. Tomorrow we have the part 3 of our poetry series called The Urgency of Poetry in a Digital Age. And next week, Media Literacy Books for All Ages. And we begin our 3-part series, Librarians on YouTube. So thank you so much for joining us. Jiwon, thank you so much for bringing Create to Learn to the South Korean community. I'm Renee Hobbs. Thanks for joining us. See you.